This Project 8200 thing was something that I did because Pat Price walked into SRI and his normal working there in the early 70s, having come up from originally down in Burbank. He then lived in Northern California. But he would come down to do sessions because Puthoff and Targ checked him out. And so he would go in and he would do things, but they had to control him because he was a gregarious, wild cat. Is that a good? He was just uncontrollable in terms of what he would do. Mm-hmm. And he came in and on Puthoff's desk, he said, "You might be interested in this. I've been interested in this for a while, and I've found 4 UFO bases around the globe. And so you really ought to look at it." And
4 UFO bases.
Yes.
And this just came in just completely random one day. This pad comes in and here it is. 4 right. UFO bases around the world. Where were they? Or where are they?
Yes, they're still there. This all happened 50 years ago, a little bit more than that now. Mount Inyangani, which is a country in Africa, isolated country. Mount Hayes is up in Australia. Mount Perdido is on the border of Spain and France. And then there's one in Australia, which I can't quite remember the name of that up in Australia.
Hayes is in Alaska, correct?
Hayes is in Alaska, yes.
Okay.
Zeal, I think, might be the one down in Australia. So this was an interesting problem for Puthoff to deal with. He says, we're watching Pat in our program here and testing and evaluating our program here at SRI. These look interesting. What is it about this that, pulls me to it? So it turns out that he calls up a friend of his called Ken Kress and says, Kit Green, and calls Kit Green. And they're friends from a long time ago when they were junior officers. Now, Kit Green is in the CIA. He went that way, and Puthoff went into being a research scientist, but they're really good friends. So he calls up Kit and says, "Could you do me a favor?" And said, "What's that?" "Well, I was wondering how things are going down in Australia. Do you know who the case officer is down in Australia, the station chief or whatever you call him?" And he says, "Well, yeah." He said, "Well, I'm just kind of interested in what things are like in Australia now. I'd like to maybe go down there someday." And so he says, "Well, let me give him a call." And so a couple of days later, he calls back and said, "Yeah, I talked to the station chief down there, and he said they really like it. They get along with the Australians just fine. They share things and work together on things. And I really like it here, too. I hope I don't get reassigned very often." Well, there is that one thing. It's all those UFOs up north. And Puthoff is like, "Oh, well, that's kind of an interesting thing, but otherwise you really like it down there." And and so Puthoff wasn't going to say anything. He says, we ought to get together next time you're back in the States here, and we'll go out and have a beer again. Remember how a good time we had when we were young officers together? He said, "Yeah, let's do that. Let's get together again." And so then Puthoff had those on his desk and told Pat, "Don't ever do this again. Go get working. You're not to do things alone. You have to follow protocol. We're being paid by an outside agency, and we have to follow our protocol, else we'll get fired. So you need to not ever do this again. Only do the things that Targ is working with you in the interview room next door. You do what things we're telling you to do so that we're in control and we can tell the CIA what we're doing.
You know, that's a very interesting demand considering it's all done in your brain. That's telling you, I mean, essentially the same thing as telling you, don't think about these things. I'm your boss. I tell you what to think and how to think.
Right.
How did Pat respond to that?
Well, I don't think I know the answer to that question,
Okay.
but he shrugged his shoulders, and I'm sure because of the maverick that he was, he didn't much care about what he said. And,
Probably motivated him to do more.
right, who knows?
My kind of guy.
So anyway, Putoff keeps it in the drawer, and then he waits because this is a big hullabaloo and people whispering to other people in the office and all that. And so he waits and he waits and he waits. Meanwhile, Putoff and I are becoming good friends. I would go out there and check on the training and check on this and everything. And they'd always take me out to dinner and do this and do this. And finally I said, you don't have to do this. I'm with you guys. I know I signed your checks now. That's what I'm doing for a while because my boss left and now I'm the boss of you. I forget what you call that when you're the person, case control officer. I don't know. Anyways, so we became more friends after a while and could visit and talk about things without him doing his job of taking care of the guy that came from Washington and making sure we take care of that guy because he's the guy who pays us. He said, don't do that. And time passed and he called me. I have a different program that I run back at Fort Meade, which I think I've explained in some of the papers I sent, is if you're not doing something because you're at war or having something you have to do, you're practicing on that. You're doing mock things that keep you in good training. Mm-hmm. You don't just lay around on the ground, you do PT and you do all the sorts of things. So I had what I called a challenge program that I did when I had remote viewers that weren't too busy and they didn't have something immediately to do. I would come up with challenge targets, like send them to a very confusing museum that went around in a circle like that and see if they could figure that out. Because, you'd be looking at this direction and then you turn around and look that direction and it would pass, 50 years in time because you're supposed to walk through the museum and look at the things. So those were challenge type targets that I did, several different kinds. So I Putoff gave me all of Pat Price's transcripts on the things. He said, do you think you could use this in a challenge target training? I didn't need the Pentagon to tell me to do it. I was the operations and training officer, and that's what I did, operations and training. On the training side, it was challenge targets. So I worked up a set of plans for taking the transcript and creating the names of the mountains where these UFO bases were, underground UFO bases were, and then did a series of challenge targets. 4 of them with Joe, who does a ERV thing, he just lays down and talks. The other people trained by Ingo Swan, and they have this very complicated structure to do their remote viewing. And so I had 6 of those, I think maybe 5. And then we had a couple of people who kind of did their own thing. And this was 10 years after. That's why I call it Project 8200, because it was 1973 when Pat Price did this, and then Putoff gave me the material here after, in his opinion, things quieted down out there and people weren't talking about this anymore. So he handed me these and see if I would run challenge targets on them. And so the Project 8200 is those challenge targets of asking Stargate remote viewers, giving them coordinates to go to and have them describe what's there.
What did he... And so these bases, were they part of the challenge targets?
That I gave them the coordinates that Price had said, this is where I was looking. So I took those coordinates and I told them to go look at these different coordinates and see what they found there. The Stargate remote viewers.
So before we get into what they saw, what did Pat see at these bases?
He described them as inside areas where 4 different kinds of groups of people who had different duties had inside places, that they were inside these mountains.
What do you mean 4 different types of people? Races, genders? What are we talking here? Just different projects that they're on?
Yeah, these 4 bases had different stories. I can read them to you what they were. They had different jobs that they did in 4 different bases. And so he would talk about, well, I'm going to go over to Mount Nyangani now, and I'm going to look at Mount Hayes. And so this is another thing that we talked about before. He just would go to this place as, well, this is very interesting over here in Mount Perdido, but I think I'll go back up to Hayes. And then his thing would change. And we had to go through the transcript very carefully. Where's he supposed to be talking about now? And then going back to the discussion we had a minute ago, how did he know which one to go to and might be more interesting and so forth? And that's just in the back of my mind now, so to speak. Silly the way I talk one way one time and say, then in the back of my mind, which I know it's not in there. Anyway, so the main thing that there was some interest in when some people would read this and say, oh my goodness, they're terrible, they're invading us, they can do this and they can monitor what our radio things are and they do this. And the single thing that Joe came up with this is, first he was worried about this whole thing in terms of him being a military man and wondering about what's all this going on here. But by the time he got through with going through all the targets, he says, they just don't want to be discovered. They don't want people around the planet to know that they're there. Mm-hmm. They don't want people hiking up the mountain and saying, hey, you guys, what are you doing here?
Who's they?
It depends on which thing you win. And I don't believe all of it. In other words, there's lots of things that they say. Mm-hmm. And like one of them is their home base is Mars. And I don't necessarily believe that, but other people have said something about that. So I'm looking specifically at the material I have and not adding in things that other people have said.
So what is the material that you had on these 4 different locations? What were they?
So we're moving to the next phase. Let me try to make sure I understand the question you're asking is that the only thing I had to start with was Price's transcript that Putoff gave me, right? Mm-hmm. And I changed them into questions.
So what was Pat's transcript specifically? What was going on at these 4 different locations? The one in Australia, Alaska, Spain, and the location in Africa.
Joe started out on his thing, and he usually lays down, and then he gets up and comes to the desk and draws for me and explains the drawing. Meanwhile, I'm tape recording the whole thing. So he says, this is for Mount Hayes in Alaska. He says, okay, before I describe these pictures here, I have to make a statement. You have to bear with my descriptions and everything, what they lack, because I find a lot of difficulty in describing this because I've never seen anything that remotely resembles this part of the target. Now, he doesn't know he's looking at Price's stuff, right? Sealed envelope and all that stuff. I've never seen anything like it, just have no familiarity with it. I mean, I don't even recognize the screws and bolts of this thing. It's just completely off the wall as far as the target. So I have nothing to relate to. So I have to present it as I envisioned it. And I ask him, what do you mean by off the wall? It's brand new. It's never existed before. This is a prototype of something completely new concept. It's like asking an Aborigine who has never seen an automobile to crawl inside the automobile and then describe in his terms, what's an automobile? When he has no terms for screws and bolts and seat covers and windows and glass and metal, even the most rudimentary parts of this thing have no meaning whatsoever. And so we kind of knew he was in trouble. Let me see here. This is the kind of position I'm in. I've seen something. I have not even a rudimentary term to explain as far as other than a Gestalt concept. And you're really asking me to draw this? So how and why my drawings are not going to be very good? Skip a little bit. Given that's true, here's page 1. I have a bunch of water, land, ice, all these general things written here, my sketch. This is generally a very desolate area, and drew a mountain range, wrote mountains. This whole range of mountains extends for thousands of miles. So I'll give you an idea of the scale of which I'm drawing and sort of put an X here where I perceive the target to be. So, he goes on in his full transcript about Mount Hayes, an icy covered mountain and so forth and so on. He has a lot of them. I want to read you, you've heard of different types of remote viewing. Joe just lays down and talks, but then Ingo Swann tells this story about you have to put them right across this way and then go down here and write that, go down here and write that. It's Ingo's technique of trying to keep thoughts and ideas organized, which makes me wonder about this whole idea of you're everywhere, every when. And Ingo, although didn't speak of it that way, tries to get you to organize these different things so that you'll stay focused on something and not try to display everything. This coordinate remote viewing here, the whole point of this exercise, other than challenge target, is to say, that thing that Price did in 93 and underground UFO bases, everything, is that a bunch of garbage, or is there any idea that maybe some of the things that he said were really true? And so the result of my thing is like, that sounds pretty darn good 10 years later. So this, I'm going to read this as a summary of one of those people that did the remote viewing by Ingo Swann. He didn't do it, but one of our trainees. His name was Bill Ray. Sight is a mountain. It is bitter cold and windy. Much snow, much wind and snow. There may be partly or completely frozen body of water nearby. The mountain is hollow. It is a large cave or crater. This has huge rooms and walls, curved high ceilings. There is an opening into the caves. The cavern is clear, sterile. There's equipment and different points there in the corridor. Some of the equipment is for monitoring, other support may be for life support. There are silver metallic ships which are very quick. They are durable and are large and small. They are used to transport people and equipment. There are some people here. They are thin, unemotional, and have programmed feelings. They are strange and have a pre-designed mission. They are freezing and cooling, semi-isolated. They feel unearthly. The site has a research feeling, the feeling like security. The people are benign and serious and are interrelated. Site end. So there are several of those. I only brought one because of time. And what I did in 8200 to find out about what Price did in 1973, some people have said to me, oh, it matches perfectly. And I'm saying, I'm not ready to go that far, but it sure sounds like, you have two people and they describe what it was like when they went to the football game. And this one describes what it was like going to the football game. They're not going to be exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's playing into it here. These are all different people trying to explain this strange thing that they're seeing while remote viewing.
Programmed thoughts. What is that? Did he expound upon that at all?
There is a different concept that these programmed thoughts people can use telepathy to tell you to turn left instead of to turn right, or you don't see anything here, some sort of programmed telepathy. One thing was an interesting thing. I was asked, well, people have gone up there, people that are UFO type people have gone up there and looked around, but they can't find how to get into the mountain. And my wife said, what makes you think they have to get into the mountain? I mean, there's lots of things on different things that are being proven now. They can walk right through them, or they can use this programmed thing and not let you see where the cave begins. That was one of the things, people were certainly worried about. And somebody said, well, wouldn't some investigators, some intelligence people go up there and find out if this is true because there's all this going on? And I said, I don't know, but I don't think they'd tell me if they did.
Mm-hmm.
And
now, what about, you had said, you had just mentioned maybe they used the programmed thoughts to conceal the entrance. What are you speaking of when you say people can walk through things?
well, first of all, what is the name of that place that they're showing on TV now where they're studying that place in the mountains where they're watching. I'm sorry, I just can't remember it right now. But they see lights coming down and going in here and then going through the mountain and popping out over here. So we have these days physically watched that happen. And the idea that, it was just my wife's comment, is what makes them think they couldn't go through the mountain, so a softer way of saying that is they could be controlled so that they can't see where they go in the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
But there also are real films now that show that happens.
How do you articulate that? What's happening there? How is that happening?
I watch it on TV like everybody else does, and I see it come down, and it's been going on for quite a while. I think you must have seen the programs. I just can't remember the name of them right now. But what do I think about that and how they do it? I don't have an answer. I know that it's been videotaped, that it's been documented by a lot of different people, and they bring in experts in to try to figure it out. And what you see in the films that they make is it goes through over here and it goes out over there. And when I watch it, I'm saying, well, look at that. I don't have the wherewithal other than whatever they're doing, something we don't know about, and that's what they're investigating.
Well, what about so this was Mount Hayes, correct, that we were just speaking of?
We're talking about Mount Hayes in that situation.
What are Pat and Joe saying about the other 3 locations? Were they identical? Were there any variations?
Yes. I don't have that here in my notes. I have it all written down at home.
Do you remember any of it?
It's well documented in my books too. If we're talking about this particular set of beings, in the 8,200 beings, I remember that they reportedly would interfere with one of our aircraft that would go over and could take satellite pictures in that range, and that satellite would have some problems because they didn't want anything to be photographed. It was very important for them not to be discovered.
Interesting.
And again, they don't seem to be dangerous or concerned with hurting us in any way. Just don't get discovered.
But they got discovered.
Well, in this particular case, with the help of Pat Price, and 10 years later with a follow-on of these remote viewers looking at it.
Had anyone else other than Joe and Pat remote viewed these locations?
Yes, I had 6, Joe did all 4 places. Pat did it, but then I had these other coordinate remote viewers or controlled remote viewers. I had 6 of those. And that's what I read you when I read you this.
Okay. Okay. So with everything that you know about this, and I mean, you set up Project 8200, I mean, what is your conclusion? What are these?
We have to ask the question softer. My job, I was an Army officer at the time, and my job to do these kinds of remote viewing things, this wasn't tasked by the anybody but me, just for training purposes. My results are these look very similar to what Pat Price did. I think that there's a validity to the Pat Price work and the work that they did. But when you take one step further is, well, what do I think about them? What are they doing? And how can they do that? And what this is? That wasn't my job. That wasn't something that I know about. It's pretty weird stuff. But it was
It's pretty weird. Weird, all right.
Project 8200 was about checking out what Price said. Mm-hmm. And my remote viewers said, well, interestingly, it matches pretty interestingly.
So we're talking 6 to 7 different remote viewers all remote viewed these locations and had something very similar to say.
Yes.
And has there been any reported activity from civilian population, news, media, anything from any of these locations?
Apparently, it is a common thing in those type of people that are UFO people or running around. There's many, many, many people who have big opinions about UFOs and want to talk about them all the time. Those people seem to know about this too a little bit, and I don't deal with talking to them. So,
what is your opinion on UFOs? Are they real?
I don't know how to answer that question. It isn't part of my job. And I hear you trying to suck things out of me in terms of, well, what do you think? Well, what do you think? And it's like, I think I did a pretty good job organizing how to find out what Price did.
Do you believe in UFOs?
You're really good in your questions. I wanted to read you a little bit of this later, but if I try to sidestep you like I'm doing right now, then you're going to draw a conclusion. I know what he's doing there. He really believes in him, but he doesn't want to tell me. On the other hand, I can say, it's an interesting subject, or I can talk more about it, or I can say, I can neither confirm nor deny. And so there's lots of different things. Do you want me to tell you some stories?
Absolutely.
When I was a very small child, living in California, when I was a kid, was out in the front yard with my mom, walking around the ivy that my dad had planted, so instead of grass, so that he didn't have to cut the grass all the time, and just had the green ivy out there, big, huge field of green ivy. And I looked up there and said, Mom, what are those 5 silver things up there? What are those things? And she just said, they call those UFOs. Don't worry about them, they're fine.